I turned their pain into profit and their lives into nightmares. I was the monster they begged to escape.
I was severely sexually abused, sodomized, and beaten.
Welcome to today's video. Imagine a man who built his life on the suffering of others, turning their dreams into despair. This is the shocking story of Herbert Blotnick, a former human trafficker who now confesses the horrifying truth about his crimes. How did he lure his victims? How did he control them? And what drove him to finally speak out? Stay with us as we uncover the dark secrets of this monstrous world. If you find this story as disturbing as we do, give this video a like, share it to raise awareness, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's dive in. He begins his confession like this. I wasn't born a monster. Monsters are made. That's the truth people don't like to hear. They want villains to be born bad, so it's easier to distance themselves. But I was just like you once, young, ambitious, and desperate for a way out of the hole life had dug for me. I grew up in a forgotten town where dreams were luxuries no one could afford. My father left when I was 6, and my mother worked 2 jobs, barely enough to keep food on the table. I spent most of my childhood angry at the world, angry at her, and angry at myself for being powerless. I swore I'd find a way to have more. I just never thought that more would come in the form of someone else's suffering. When I was 19, I met Victor. He wasn't just charismatic, he was magnetic. He drove a black Mercedes, wore tailored suits, and exuded confidence. To a kid like me, he was everything I wanted to be. He told me he ran a business, helping people find opportunities, he said. He never mentioned the word trafficking. At first, my job seemed harmless. I'd pick up girls from bus stations, some barely older than me, and drop them off at apartments or motels. They were quiet, scared, but I didn't think much of it. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want answers. The money was too good. $500 for a night's work. That's what I told myself. It's just work. But the truth is, deep down, I knew. The bruises, the empty eyes, the way they flinched at every loud noise. I knew something wasn't right. The first time I crossed the line, I remember every detail. Victor asked me to keep an eye on a girl named Sophia while he handled business. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her wrists were raw from being tied, and her voice was hoarse from screaming. She begged me to let her go. Please, I just want to go home. I'll never tell anyone. I swear. I stood there, frozen. A part of me wanted to open the door and let her run, but another part, the darker part, thought about what Victor would do if I disobeyed him. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, so I turned my back. I heard her crying as I walked away, and something inside me died that night. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how easy it became. Every time I ignored a scream, every time I watched a girl disappear into a motel room with a stranger, it got a little easier. I stopped seeing them as people. They became numbers, quotas, commodities. She's just another one, I'd tell myself. If it's not me, someone else will do it. That's the lie I clung to. Over time, I started taking on more responsibility. Victor trusted me to handle recruitment, transportation, and even discipline. Discipline. That's a sanitized word for torture, isn't it? I was good at it too. Too good. I remember a girl named Maya. She tried to escape during a transport. We caught her a few blocks away, hiding behind a dumpster. She was shaking, covered in dirt, and begging for mercy. Victor handed me a crowbar and told me to teach her a lesson. I hesitated for a second, a single, fleeting second, and then I swung. The sound of metal hitting bone is something you never forget. It's a hollow, sickening thud that echoes in your head long after it's over. That was the moment I knew I'd crossed the point of no return. I wasn't just complicit anymore. I was part of the machine. I was the monster that parents warn their children about. And the scariest part? I didn't care. The money kept rolling in. I moved out of my mother's dingy apartment and into a condo with floor-to-ceiling windows. I bought the car, the clothes, the life I always dreamed of, and every time I looked in the mirror, I told myself it was worth it. I deserved this. I'd earned it. But the nightmares started soon after. At first, it was just flashes, faces of the girls I'd hurt, their screams, their begging. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. But as the years went on, the dreams got worse. I'd see myself standing over their bodies, blood on my hands, their lifeless eyes staring back at me. I tried drowning the guilt in alcohol, drugs, and parties, but nothing worked. The monster I'd become was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to remind me of what I'd done. And yet, I couldn't stop. By the time I was 25, I was running my own operation. Victor had moved on to bigger things, leaving me in charge. I had men working under me, a network of drivers, recruiters, and enforcers. We operated like a well-oiled machine, trafficking dozens of girls across state lines every month. But the money, the power, it wasn't enough anymore. I started to crave something darker, control, domination. I began taking pleasure in breaking them, watching the light leave their eyes as they realized no one was coming to save them. That's the thing about monsters. We don't just thrive in the darkness. We are the darkness. Was still there gnawing at the edges of my mind. But Victor kept pushing me deeper. He showed me how to use their pain, their desperation against them. He said, every sob story is a key. Find the right one and you can unlock them. And it worked, every time. The runaways were easy, but it wasn't just them. We targeted single mothers, immigrant women, even college girls trying to make rent. Social media became our biggest hunting ground. I'd scroll through Instagram, looking for posts that screamed vulnerability. I can't take this anymore. I just want someone to care. Those were my signals. We'd slide into their DMs, pretending to be someone who could fix all their problems. Sometimes we posed as recruiters for modeling agencies. Other times we played the part of a charming boyfriend. It didn't matter what story we used. The end was always the same. The ones who resisted the promises were often the most fun. I know how sick that sounds, but it's the truth. There's something about breaking a strong girl that gives you a rush. I remember a college student named Megan. She was smart, sharp-tongued, and full of fight. She thought she was too good to fall for our tricks. But it only took a month of sweet words, fake love, and expensive gifts before she was doing exactly what we wanted. That's when I started to feel powerful. Every girl who fell into my trap made me feel like a god. I controlled them. What they ate, where they slept, who they talked to. They belonged to me. But even gods get bored. Once I had them under my thumb, I started to get creative. I'd test how far I could push them. Could I make them lie to their parents, run away from their families, turn against the people who loved them most? And when they did, I felt invincible. Then came the darker games. Victor told me there were always ways to make more money, and that meant finding girls who would do things others wouldn't. That's when I started targeting the ones who looked broken beyond repair. The ones who'd already been abused, who carried the weight of someone else's sins. I thought I was just playing the game, moving pieces around a board. But the truth is, I was creating monsters too. I wasn't just breaking them, I was turning them into shadows of myself. And the more I did it, the less I cared. I stopped seeing them as people. I didn't notice the way their eyes dimmed or how their voices became flat. I stopped hearing the terror in their whispers. All I saw were dollar signs. All I cared about was who would be next. Looking back now, I realized that's when I truly became the monster. Not when I picked up the crowbar, not when I locked them in rooms or told them they'd never see their families again. It was when I stopped feeling anything at all. That's how you know you've lost your humanity, when someone begs you for their life, and all you can think about is whether you'll make your quota for the night. And I didn't just lose my humanity, I threw it away. It's not enough to catch them, that's just the start. The real work begins when you strip away their resistance, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but obedience. That's when you own them. And I was good at that, too good. The first step was always the isolation. You have to cut them off from the outside world, sever every tie that gives them hope. Once they were in, we took their phones. For your safety, I'd tell them, pretending to care. We kept them away from windows, locked doors, and familiar places. Even if they wanted to scream, there was no one to hear them. I remember one girl, Tessa. She was a fighter. I'll never forget the fire in her eyes when she realized what was happening. She clawed, bit, and screamed for hours until her voice was raw. I admired her, in a sick way, but I couldn't let her win. After her first failed attempt to escape, I sat her down in the middle of a dimly lit room. My enforcer, Danny, stood in the corner, arms crossed. He was there for intimidation, but I didn't need him. I could break her without laying a finger on her. Tessa, I said calmly, almost kindly, do you know what happens to girls who try to run? She didn't answer, just glared at me with those defiant eyes. I nodded to Danny and he dragged in another girl, Ashley. She was thin, pale and trembling, her arms covered in bruises. This is what happens, I said. Then I stood back as Danny beat Ashley in front of her. The room echoed with the sounds of fists meeting flesh, of Ashley's sobs and Tessa's muffled screams as I held her in place, forcing her to watch. When it was over, Ashley was barely conscious. I leaned in close to Tessa and whispered, "That's your future if you don't behave." She didn't try to run after that. She didn't even speak unless I told her to. But sometimes fear wasn't enough. Sometimes they needed to be completely broken. That's where the drugs came in. Meth, heroin, pills, whatever it took to keep them pliable and dependent. At first, I'd give it to them as a gift, a little something to help them relax. But it didn't take long before they were begging for it. Once the withdrawal set in, they'd do anything to get their next fix. Anything. I remember another girl, Maria. She was desperate, her hands shaking, her eyes hollow. "Please, I'll do whatever you want," she whispered. And she did. Drugs weren't the only tools we used. Sleep deprivation worked wonders too. I'd keep them awake for days, cycling them through client after client until they didn't know what was real anymore. They'd collapse in the middle of a job, and I'd throw cold water on their faces to wake them up. "You can sleep when you're dead," I'd say. One time, I pushed a girl so hard she passed out in the middle of a casino floor. Security asked if she was okay, and I laughed, pretending she was just drunk. But inside, I felt nothing. Not guilt, not pity, nothing. It wasn't just about control, it was about domination. I wanted them to know there was no escape, no salvation. I'd make them call me by different names, boss, sir, even daddy. I wanted them to associate me with everything they needed, food, shelter, survival. But the sickest part, the part I still can't believe I enjoyed, was watching the light leave their eyes. That moment when they realized they had no one, no hope. That's when they stopped being human to me. They became tools, machines built to earn. I kept detailed records of each girl, how much money they brought in, how many clients they saw, how often they needed discipline. It was a business, and I treated it like one. Quotas weren't suggestions, they were rules, but $500 a day, minimum. If they didn't hit that number, there were consequences. Punishment wasn't just about pain, it was about humiliation. I'd make them crawl on their hands and knees, begging for forgiveness. I'd force them to do things they swore they'd never do, just to prove I owned them. And when they cried, when they begged me to stop, I'd smile and say, "You chose this." But they didn't choose it, did they? That's the lie I told myself to sleep at night. They walked into this willingly, I'd think. I'm not forcing them, but deep down, I knew the truth. They didn't choose this life, I chose it for them. And the deeper I sank into this world, the more the monster inside me grew. I stopped seeing their tears, their pain, their humanity. They were just numbers, and I was the one pulling the strings. But even monsters have nightmares, and mine were just beginning. They don't last forever, none of them do. Their bodies wear down, their spirits shatter. Some fight too hard, others break too easily. Either way, there comes a point when they're no longer useful. That's when the monster inside me truly thrived. At first, I let Victor handle it. He'd call it cleaning up loose ends. I didn't ask questions and he didn't give details. All I knew was that the girls who stopped meeting their quotas disappeared. But as I climbed the ranks, I started seeing things I couldn't unsee. The first time it fell on me to handle a problem, I hesitated. Her name was Lily. She'd been with us for months, but her body was starting to fail. Too many drugs, too many nights with men who treated her like garbage. She coughed constantly, her eyes sunken, her skin pale and bruised. Victor told me, "She's a liability now. We can't afford liabilities." So one night I drove her out to the woods. She sat in the passenger seat, trembling but silent. She knew what was coming. They always know. I parked the car and we walked into the darkness. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll get better. I promise." I didn't answer. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, but I kept moving. When we reached a clearing, I stopped. She fell to her knees, crying, begging for her life. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," I said. My voice was cold, detached, but inside I was screaming. I didn't pull the trigger that night. I couldn't. Instead, I left her there, alone in the freezing cold. By the time I got back to the car, Victor was waiting. He didn't say anything, just nodded to one of his guys. They went back for her. I never saw her again. After that, it got easier, too easy. There was a girl named Anna who tried to run. We caught her a few hours later, hiding in an abandoned warehouse. She was barefoot, her clothes torn, her face streaked with tears. When I found her, I didn't feel pity. I felt rage. She'd embarrassed me, made me look weak in front of my crew. I dragged her back to the car, throwing her in the trunk like she was nothing more than cargo. Victor wasn't around this time. This one was on me. I took her to an empty lot on the edge of town. It was raining, the ground turning to mud beneath my feet. I yanked her out of the trunk, her body limp with exhaustion. "You thought you could run," I snarled. She didn't answer, just stared at me with hollow eyes. That's what broke me, the emptiness. She wasn't even scared anymore. She'd given up completely. I wanted her to feel something, anything, fear, pain, regret. So I hit her, once, twice, again and again, until my knuckles were raw and her blood mixed with the rain. When it was over, I stood there panting, my chest heaving. She didn't move. I told myself she was just unconscious, but deep down, I knew. I left her there, her body half buried in the mud, and drove away without looking back. That night I didn't sleep. I told myself it was her fault. She shouldn't have run. She shouldn't have made me do it. But no matter how many times I repeated the lie, I couldn't drown out the sound of her bones breaking under my fists. And then there was Sophie. She was the last one. She'd been with us for over a year and she was good, one of the best. But one day she stopped trying. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't work, wouldn't speak. It was like she'd turned herself into a ghost. Victor told me to get rid of her. He said she was bad for morale. I took her to an old motel on the outskirts of town. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just sat there, staring at the stained carpet, like she was already dead. I don't know why, but I hesitated. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, like she could see through all the lies I told myself. Or maybe I was just tired of being the monster. But Victor wasn't. He showed up with two of his guys, dragging Sophie out of the room while I stood there frozen. They took her to the desert, where no one would ever find her. After that, something inside me snapped. I stopped caring about the money, the power, the fear I used to thrive on. All I could see were the faces of the girls I'd destroyed. Their screams echoed in my mind, haunting me every second of every day. I started drinking more, taking more drugs, anything to numb the guilt, but it never went away. It just grew louder, drowning out everything else. By the time the cops finally caught up with me, I was relieved. I wanted it to end. I wanted someone to stop me, to make me pay for the things I'd done. But even now, sitting in this cell, I can't escape them. They visit me every night in my dreams, their lifeless eyes staring back at me, their voices whispering, "Why didn't you save us?" And the truth is, I don't have an answer. I used to think I was invincible, that no one could touch me. When you spend years outsmarting the law, manipulating people, and building a network so tight it feels impenetrable, you start to believe you're untouchable. But arrogance has a price, and mine nearly killed me. It started with a slip. One of my guys got sloppy, left a paper trail when moving money. It wasn't much, just a few bank statements that didn't add up, but it was enough to catch someone's attention. Suddenly, there were whispers of investigations. Names started appearing in police reports. People I trusted were being questioned. At first, I laughed it off. They'll never find anything, I told myself. But the fear was there, growing in the pit of my stomach. I started looking over my shoulder more often, avoiding familiar places. I changed phones every week, switched cars like they were disposable. Paranoia became my constant companion. The first raid hit one of our safe houses. I remember getting the call at 3 a.m. Danny was on the other end, his voice shaking for the first time ever. "They got the place, man. They took the girls. They're asking questions." I didn't respond. I just hung up and stared at the phone, my heart pounding. My first thought wasn't about the girls or the men who might flip under pressure. It was about myself. How far was this going to go? How close were they to me? The next few weeks were a blur of chaos. Safe houses were abandoned, phones destroyed, loose ends tied up in the most brutal ways imaginable. Victor called it damage control. I called it desperation. One night I was sitting in a dingy motel room on the edge of town, watching the news. My face didn't appear on the screen, but the stories did. "Trafficking ring under investigation," the anchor said, her voice calm and detached as if she were reading the weather. They showed images of some of the girls who'd been rescued, thin, pale, their eyes filled with a mix of relief and terror. I should have felt something, guilt, fear, regret, but all I felt was rage. Rage at the girls for talking, at the cops for closing in, at myself for letting it get this far. That's when I made the decision to run. Victor tried to convince me to stay. "You're overreacting," he said. "We've handled worse." But I knew better. The net was closing, and I wasn't about to get caught. I left everything behind that night, the cars, the money, even the condo I'd worked so hard to buy. All I had was a duffel bag full of cash, a burner phone, and a fake passport. I headed south, crossing the border into Mexico before sunrise. The first few weeks on the run felt like freedom. No more responsibilities, no more quotas, no more screaming girls haunting my nights. I rented a small house near the coast, drank cheap tequila, and tried to convince myself I could start over. But the past has a way of catching up with you. One night, I was sitting on the porch, staring at the ocean, when I saw her. A girl, no older than 14, walking along the shoreline, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked like one of mine. For a moment, I thought she was. Her face was familiar, though I couldn't place it. My chest tightened, and I felt the air leave my lungs. I tried to tell myself it was just the alcohol messing with my head, but the whispers started. "Why didn't you save us?" I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty house, the creak of the wooden floorboards, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. That's when the dreams began. Every night I'd see their faces, the girls I'd used, discarded, left to die. Their eyes would bore into me, hollow and accusing. Sometimes they screamed, their voices rising like a chorus of agony. Other times they just stared, silent and unblinking. I started drinking more, trying to drown them out, but no matter how much I drank, the dreams kept coming. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. My body began to deteriorate just like theirs had. It felt like justice. Then came the calls. The burner phone rang at odd hours, the voice on the other end distorted and mechanical. "We know where you are," it said one night. Another time, "You can't run forever." At first, I thought it was the cops, maybe even Victor. But then the calls started getting personal. They mentioned names: Lily, Anna, Sophie. Names I'd tried so hard to forget. I started moving again, never staying in one place for more than a few days. I dyed my hair, grew a beard, changed my name. But it didn't matter. The ghosts followed me everywhere. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. I grabbed the knife I kept under my pillow and crept to the door, my heart pounding. But when I threw it open, there was nothing there, just the wind and the endless expanse of darkness. But I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. By the time they found me, I was already a shell of myself. The man who used to command fear and respect was gone, replaced by a broken, paranoid wreck. The cops kicked down the door of the shabby apartment I was hiding in, their guns drawn, their voices shouting commands I barely heard. I didn't resist. I just dropped to my knees and let them take me. As they dragged me out into the blinding sunlight, I realized something. The monster I'd become wasn't just in me, it was around me, in the system I'd helped build, in the lives I'd destroyed, in the darkness that still lingered in the world. And no matter how far I ran, I could never escape it. They sat me in a cold, windowless room. The walls were white, sterile, and the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and old sweat. Two agents faced me across the metal table, their faces stone cold, their eyes drilling into me like I was some kind of specimen. Maybe I was. I'd been running for years, haunted by ghosts I couldn't outrun. But now, I was here, cornered, trapped. I was tired of the fear, of the guilt, of dragging my sins around like dead weight. So, when they asked me to talk, I didn't fight. I gave them everything. "Start from the beginning," one of them said. I leaned back in the chair, my wrists still cuffed, the metal biting into my skin. "You think you know how this works?" I said, my voice hoarse from days of silence. You don't have an expletive clue." Their expressions didn't change. They just stared, waiting. So I started talking. "We didn't snatch them off the streets, not most of the time," I began. "That's the first thing everyone gets wrong. Why risk a kidnapping charge when they'll walk right into your trap? Most of them came to us willingly, desperate for something we pretended to offer." I told them about the bus stations, the shelters, the Instagram DMs. "We played the long game," I explained. "You don't just grab someone and throw them into a nightmare. You lure them. You make them trust you, love you even." The younger ones? They were the easiest. A stuffed animal, a warm meal, a fake promise of safety, that's all it took. But the older ones, the ones with fire in their eyes, they were my favorite. I'd spend weeks breaking them down piece by piece until they didn't even know who they were anymore. I could see the disgust in the agents' faces, but I didn't stop. They wanted the truth, and I was going to give it to them. Once we had them, we moved them fast. Back then we had routes, interstate highways, back roads, even shipping containers for the ones going overseas. I paused, remembering the claustrophobic smell of sweat and urine that clung to those containers. "We packed them in like cargo," I said, my voice dropping. "No windows, no light, just enough air to keep them alive." One of the agents leaned forward, his fists clenched. "How many?" I shrugged. "Hundreds, maybe more. We didn't keep track. They weren't people. They were products." Training. That's the word we used to justify what we did to them. It made it sound professional, organized, like we were running some kind of business instead of a torture chamber. "We'd start with isolation," I said, my voice steady, like I was reading a script. "Lock them in a room for days, cut them off from everything they knew. Then came the drugs. Meth was the best. Kept them awake, compliant, desperate." The agents didn't say a word, but I could see their jaws tighten. I smiled bitterly. "You think that's bad? It gets worse." I told them about the websites, the fake profiles, the coded language. "You think Craigslist is for selling furniture?" I said with a hollow laugh. "It was one of our biggest platforms before they cracked down." I explained how we'd post pictures, some real, some stolen, from modeling sites or social media. "We made them look willing," I said. "That's the trick. You don't want clients thinking they're buying damaged goods. You sell them a fantasy." "You want to know who paid for this?" I asked, leaning forward. "It wasn't just the creeps in dark alleys. It was businessmen, politicians, even cops, people like you." I saw their faces harden, their anger barely contained. "Don't act surprised," I said, my voice cold. "This industry survives because of people like them, like you. They tell you that time in a cell changes a man, that staring at 4 concrete walls day after day somehow purifies you, burns away the evil, and leaves something clean behind. But those walls didn't change me. They just trapped me with the monster I created. At first I welcomed the silence. After years of chaos, screaming girls, barking orders, the endless sound of deals being made in dark rooms, the quiet felt like a gift. But silence doesn't stay quiet for long. It becomes a mirror, forcing you to see every horror you've tried to bury. And believe me, I've tried. It started with their faces. At night I'd lie on the cold metal cot, staring at the ceiling, and they'd come. One by one, their eyes empty, their mouths moving but making no sound. I didn't need to hear them. I knew what they were saying. "Why didn't you save us?" During the day, I'd hear their footsteps echoing in the hallways. When I turned around, no one was there, but I could feel them. Their presence was suffocating, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. There was one girl I couldn't shake, Sophie. The way she looked at me that last night, her silence louder than any scream. In my dreams, she never stopped staring. Sometimes I wake up gasping for air, her name stuck in my throat. The prison chaplain says everyone deserves forgiveness. I laugh every time he says it. "You don't know what I've done," I told him once. His face didn't flinch, but I saw the pity in his eyes. "Forgiveness isn't for them," he said. "It's for you." But what does forgiveness mean when you've done the things I've done? When you've watched life drain from someone's eyes and felt nothing, when you've turned people into commodities, stripped them of their humanity and discarded them like trash. Forgiveness feels like a lie. A few weeks ago I got a letter. It was from one of the girls, Maria. She was one of the lucky ones, if you can call it that. She got out before it was too late. Her letter was short. No anger, no accusations, just a single sentence that's been circling in my mind ever since. "I hope you find peace one day." Peace. I laughed when I read it. What does she know about peace? What does she know about the hell I live in every second of every day? But then I thought about it. Maybe she wasn't talking about me finding peace. Maybe she was telling me to stop looking for it. The truth is, I don't want peace. I don't deserve it. I've spent my life creating chaos, destroying innocence, and feeding the very darkness I'm now trying to fight. Peace isn't for people like me. I see that now. My role isn't to be forgiven or to move on. It's to carry the weight of what I've done, to feel every ounce of guilt and shame until it crushes me. That's my punishment. And maybe in some twisted way, that's my redemption too.